Because we've now somehow gone beyond the threshold of death, we're able to study what happens to mind and consciousness when the brain is potentially shut down.
Dr. Sam Parnia has pored over thousands of stories of near-death experiences. He is trying to explain what happens between life and death. Is there a soul?
We can somehow answer this age-old question that people have had for millennia, which is it the brain cells that are producing your consciousness, or is it some other process that we don't understand yet?
He is studying cardiac arrest patients who claim to remember leaving their bodies and witnessing what was going on below. He places pictures high up in the corners of hospital rooms where they cannot be seen by anyone unless they physically leave their body and hover above the scene.
The images vary. What we can then do is simply put an image on this side that's only visible if you're looking from the ceiling down.
But if a brain-dead person is then revived and has memories of being somewhere after clinical death, how could you explain it?
That's why you can't explain away people's experiences as being a dream, because you can't dream or have a hallucination if you're flatlined on your brain. In order for you to hallucinate, you have to have a functioning brain.
So when I was hit and I was knocked unconscious, was my brain working or not working?
In your case, your brain was working still because you did not have a complete cessation of blood flow into the brain. You had a particular part that was injured.
So what caused me to see what I saw?
As you asked me, was I really looking down at myself, or was that just a dream? I don't know. And if anyone says they know, it's just they're speculating. We don't have evidence yet. What we know is that when someone dies, that process of dying and the cessation of heartbeat and circulation to the brain will trigger a part of the brain that mediates people having an out-of-body experience.
Results of his study are expected next year, and if enough patients report seeing those images, he could have proof that there is a soul.
So what happens when we die? It's a question that humanity has wrestled with throughout history. But a new study conducted by NYU may have found some answers. Dr. Sam Parnia is the Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation Research at NYU Langone School of Medicine, where he ran this study. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Parnia.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What would you say, what actually happens when you're clinically dead?
You know, when people die, essentially it's when the heart stops. So this has been going on for, as far as we know, millennia, not longer. And when the heart stops, you stop breathing and your brain shuts down, and that's how we declare people dead. And that's why we give a time of death and we give them a note. And really, to be honest with you, until about 50 years ago, that was the point of death. So people become lifeless, motionless, the brain shuts down. But now through advances in medicine, we can actually bring people back to life even after they've gone beyond that threshold of death, and study what happens to them. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that the brain completely shuts down, as I said. But what's fascinating is that the cells inside the body, and particularly the cells inside the brain, do not suddenly become annihilated. They go through a process of decay that can take a few hours, which is why we can actually medically bring people back to life after they have technically gone beyond that threshold of death for tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards. And that, of course, raises many interesting questions about what happens when we die.
So tell me more about this study. How did you conduct it? And tell me about, how you came about reaching your findings, your conclusion.
I'm an intensive care doctor, so my job is to essentially save people's lives and prevent them from dying. But unfortunately, people do die, and we try to revive them. What we have found is that over the last few decades, many millions of people have now come back, and many of them have reported, actually, anecdotally, that they've been able to see and hear things going on, even though from our perspective, they should have been dead and their brain should not be functioning at all. And so we became intrigued to study this, one, because it was fascinating, and two, because we tried to revive people without brain damage and to ensure they don't have any disorders of consciousness, so not becoming like brain damaged or having a vegetative state. At any rate, so this particular study is the largest study ever carried out in the world. It was done in 15 medical centers across the US and in Europe. And we studied more than 2,000 people who'd gone through this cardiac arrest or process of death. And we did not expect people to have any consciousness or awareness, but intriguingly, up to 40% of people came back and had a perception of being aware of what was happening to them, even though they had technically gone beyond the threshold of death.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot to it. I should also add that among that group, 10% had a very deep, profound mystical experience that was very true to them. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated. So of course the question is, why does that happen? And we don't have the answers because to our scientific model, when people have died, there should be no more conscious awareness going on. But it sounds like maybe consciousness is able to continue. And by that, I don't mean that they're awake, but that entity that makes us who we are, makes Sam who he is, makes Rena who she is, the self, the mind, seems to continue and doesn't become annihilated after a person has gone through their process of death.
Were there any of the people that you studied that completely lost all consciousness?
Well, that's what I was trying to explain.
Yeah.
Everybody loses consciousness immediately as soon as the heart stops. It's not like they're awake and watching us.
Well, you mentioned that there were some people who remembered there was some sort of mystical experience that they were going
Right.
through. Were there some people who said, nope, didn't feel anything, didn't?
So some people don't have any recollections. What we don't know is whether they had experiences and forgot it afterwards, and that may be what's happening. Because of course we forget a lot of things, and most of the people who are brought back have issues to do with their treatments. We give them sedative drugs, which wipes out their memories. So that's part of what we're studying now is, does everybody have this experience? And how long does mind and consciousness continue in some format, even though we've gone beyond the threshold of death?
Do you have some sort of conclusion as to how far the mind and consciousness goes?
Again, from what we can determine, which
Yeah.
is actually fascinating, and it raises questions about our whole science, about what happens when we die, is that it appears that even though people have gone beyond that threshold of death and their brain has shut down, that entity that we call consciousness, the mind, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, does not seem to become annihilated. From the evidence we have, that at least tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards, how long beyond that, we don't know at this point.
For the folks who have lost consciousness and come back, have there been any long-term effects afterwards?
Well, those people who have these very deep, profound, mystical experiences, often they describe a sensation of being very peaceful, seeing a bright, warm, welcoming light, sometimes deceased relatives. And intriguingly, some of them describe a sensation of a being that they describe as being perfect and full of light and love and compassion. Those who have that experience are often very positively transformed for the rest of their lives. It's very profound, it's
Really?
real to them. They become less afraid of death. They lose their fear of death completely. They engage in altruism. They're more helpful to people. They engage more with family. It completely changes them. So there's something very profound about this experience that they have.
We often hear people say, I saw the light, some sort of light. Why do you think it is that some people see that and some people don't?
Well, so there are two possibilities. One is that, as you said, only some people see it, and we think that, it might be 10%. But the alternative is that everyone sees it. But unfortunately, because of the medical treatments that they get afterwards in the intensive care unit by doctors such as myself, to save their brain, they forget it. And one of our new studies is trying to actually decipher whether people have had it but just forgotten about it. And so I think there is some evidence that more people are having it, but unfortunately they just forget it afterwards.
It's a fascinating study and a fascinating look into death and those final moments as well and returning back. Dr. Sam Parnia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be
Yeah.
here. Everyone has a perception about death, and it's really something that's framed based upon our history, our culture. But it's important to understand, I'm an intensive care doctor. My job is to save people's lives when they become very sick, and to try to ensure that they don't cross beyond the threshold of death. But unfortunately, people do sometimes. And so what we now know is that there is a science by which we can save people's lives and ensure they don't come back without brain damage. But also what that science is telling us is about what happens when we die. What is the human experience of death? What happens to consciousness? What happens to our mind? Do we become annihilated? Now, traditionally, these are thought to be philosophical or religious questions, but today they're really in the forefront of science. So what does happen when we die? Essentially, death is a process. It's not a black and white moment. What happens is, no matter why we become sick, whether it's a heart attack, it's a stroke, whether we have a car accident, it doesn't matter why, but the final result is that we have a reduction in the oxygen that gets inside the brain when we're about to die. And that causes our brain circuits to shut down and we become unconscious to the outside world. When the heart stops, all life processes go out because there's no more blood getting into the brain, into your kidneys, into your livers, and we become lifeless, motionless. And that's the time that doctors use to give us a time of death. But what's really remarkable, and that has been discovered in the last 10 or 20 years, is that actually it's only after we die, after we go beyond the threshold of death, that the cells inside the body start to decompose. And they don't decompose even in the brain in just a few minutes. It can take many hours of time. So what that means is we are dead when we die. It's not that we weren't dead. We are dead. But the cells are starting to go through their own process of death. our brain doesn't work, but we're gradually decomposing. From my perspective, that means that we have a lot of time to bring people back if we know what to do. So what are the things we can do? We can cool the brain down because we know that it's a chemical process and we can slow down the rate by which cells die, restart the heart again and reverse the process that caused them to die if there is a science available to do that at this time. Now, a lot of people are afraid of death because it's the unknown. But what we actually know is that when we die, if we sort of jump into the person's body at that time, that experience is not unpleasant for the vast majority of people. Put aside those who've tried to commit suicide or done something like that to themselves. For those of us who die naturally, what happens is even if we were in pain before we died, the process of death becomes very comfortable, it's very blissful, it's peaceful. And what people then describe to us is incredible. They describe a sensation of experiencing a bright, warm, welcoming light that draws the person towards it. They describe a sensation sometimes of experiencing their deceased relatives almost as if they've come to welcome them. They describe that they actually didn't want to come back anymore in many cases. It's so comfortable and it's like a magnet that draws them that they don't want to come back. A lot of them, and what is fascinating from my perspective, is they actually describe a sensation of separating from themselves and watching doctors and nurses working on them. They can hear things, they can recall all conversations, they can see everything, and they describe in clear detail what had happened, which means it can't be a hallucination because they come back and tell us everything that we were doing. They're describing real events, not imaginary events. Doctors and nurses are like, I don't know how he told me this because he was dead. And some of them describe a sensation where they actually review everything that they have done. So if I hurt somebody, whether on purpose or unintentionally, if I said something that was spiteful, then I experience that exact pain that I may have caused you or somebody else. And so I judge myself. Somebody else doesn't judge me. I realize what I should have done. Obviously, for most people, they're not going to come back to tell us. But because of our science, we can now bring people back, and those who come back tell us exactly what the experience of death was like for them. And what's really profound is that they become transformed in a very positive way. They see life very differently. Now they realize that life had more meaning. They've been given a second chance and they can do things differently. And by and large, what they say is that we realize we should have tried to be of more service to others, try to spend more time with our families, try to help others much more, essentially be less self-centered and more altruistic. Now, somebody might say, well, how do we know this is true? I think it's important to explain two things. One is that until very recently, we couldn't bring people back after they had died. Okay? And so basically, it was thought to be purely philosophical or religious. But today, there is a science by which we can bring them back. And it's like the old days, you know, when people set out from Europe to go to find the Americas, and they found all these amazing creatures and these amazing experiences nobody had seen before. When they came back and told people, a lot of people never believed them. They thought they were drunk, they thought they were imagining it. It's important to understand, though, that this is an experience that has been described from all over the world, sometimes from children less than 3 years old, who have no idea about life, death, the afterlife, religious questions, and they all describe the same thing. I had a small child who told me that when I died, I experienced a bright lamp. So they used children's terminology, and he drew a picture of it with a lamp, and he said, when you die, you're connected by a cord to the lamp, and it's the cord that gets cut when you go. Of course, he didn't say it like that, but he said it during the course of play. Gradually, it built up. And adults have said the same thing to us as well. These experiences have been described from all over the world, from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, from the United States. And what we see is that the experience is very much the same, but the interpretation, frankly, like any experience, depends on the person's background. So, for instance, if a Christian person has this experience and they see a being full of love and compassion, they say that I saw Christ. But if you actually really push them, they say, well, I don't know if it was Christ. I expected it to be Christ because I believe that. And if you talk to a Hindu, they may say that I saw one of the Hindu gods. And if you talk to an atheist, they'll say, well, I don't know why I had this experience because I don't believe in anything anyway, but, well, I did see this being of light and it was really full of love and compassion, and I don't know how to account for it, but I think it's going to change the way I'm going to live my life. So I think what I'd like to simply end with is to say that while we are afraid of death, because it is the unknown, and unfortunately it's an inevitable consequence from all of us, despite all the medical care that we try to provide, that there is now a science, and that death does not have to be limited to philosophy or religion, but it can be explored through these means. And it helps us to understand how we should obviously provide medical care from my perspective, but also how we should live our lives today to give ourselves more meaning and to make sure that when we do reach that end, as somebody once said to me, I don't want to fail. I feel like I lived my life with a D. I was given a second chance. I hope that when I go back the second time, I'll be given a C at the very least when I go back. I hope this was useful to you.
Look what's happening to us beyond death. Can we have a glance what happens to us, what we will experience shortly after we have died? Actually, we can. We can look beyond death. Because of all those people we bring back successfully, we resuscitate successfully, 20% in the Western countries and more than 30% in the Eastern countries report something to us which we call near-death experiences. Those near-death experiences are reported all over the world. And those reports show striking similarities and reveal a pattern. This means death sets in, and those people who have a near-death experience, the first phase is there's a sudden change. And from one instant to the other, all pain is gone. All anxiety is gone. All fear is gone. All noises are gone. And there's just peace, calmness, and tranquility. Some report joy. And quite a number report something startling. There's an insight. The insight, I am dead now. This is what we call death. And this insight is there without any anxiety. The second phase of the near-death experiences is, again, a sudden change. And those people report that they are floating above themselves. They are floating above themselves, see themselves lying down on the stretcher, see us emergency physicians and emergency nurses trying everything to bring them back. They see from above what we are doing, and they can listen what we say. The personality of the person who is gone is still the same, but they have left their body. We call this out-of-body experience. And what is annoying to us is that those people actually can describe what we did and can report what we said when they come back. We have no explanation for this.